We now continue moral methods, looking at resolving conceptual disputes. Now, when addressing an ethical issue or moral issue, there will generally be relevant concepts. That is to say, terms, notions, ideas, etc., that are relevant to the ethical issue at hand. And when disputing concepts, what must be determined is the meaning and applicability of these concepts. What do these terms mean? And for example, concepts would include things like lying, person, legitimacy. Obviously, things like good and evil themselves are concepts. Now, as with relevant facts, the key question is the concept relevant or not? I mean, obviously you don't want to focus on concepts that simply don't matter, although there can be dispute over which concepts are in fact relevant. And you also want to consider which ones are actually in dispute. In some cases, relevant concepts will in fact be in meaningful, significant dispute. And if you make use of them in your paper, then you'll need to resolve them in order to use the concepts the way you want to use them. For example, although people often tend to simply assume that their conception of personhood is just correct and everyone else is wrong when addressing an issue like abortion, that is a contentious concept. Personhood is not something that everyone agrees on. And so if someone wanted to argue about abortion using the concept of personhood and wanted to present a serious argument, they would have to present and defend their concept of personhood, like whether they're arguing, that abortion is morally acceptable or unacceptable. Now, as another example, think about copying video games, movies, etc. Now, it may seem intuitive to simply see that as, stealing, but the concept of stealing can be in dispute there. What it counts to steal something. Now, people may agree that the concept applies, but disagree as to what type of theft it might be. As a final example, consider cheating, in a relationship. And that may seem something very straightforward that doesn't need to be defined, but the information age, the internet and stuff has made things more complicated. Traditional cheating was pretty straightforward. It had it involved physical contact of a certain sort, and obviously that cannot occur. Physical contact cannot occur online. But then there's a question of things like, what if someone is being engaged in emotional behavior through the context of a video game or chat, etc.? Would that count as cheating? And as technology, evolves, would say virtual interaction of a certain nature, would that be considered cheating? I mean, it wouldn't be, meet the old physical definition. And so we'd have to debate that relevant concept of cheating. Now, in some cases, the relevant concepts won't be in dispute. To use kind of a silly example, an obvious example, when it comes to copying, video games, movies, etc., copying is a concept, but it's not something that people dispute. Similarly, like in capital punishment, killing is a concept, but no one disputes that capital punishment involves killing because, by definition, it does. So you have to sort out which concepts are important and which ones are in dispute. Now, as with the facts, people can agree on concepts and disagree about the morality, and the reverse can hold as well. For example, you could have two people agreeing on the definition of person, what it is to be a person, but disagree about the ethics of abortion or euthanasia, for example. People might disagree about what counts as lying, but both agree that lying is wrong. Or people both might agree that democracy is good, but disagree on what counts as democracy. Because we tend to think democracy is everyone gets to vote, but obviously that's not the case, because even in pretty broad democracy, people that are babies don't get to vote. Typically, young children don't get to vote. People who aren't citizens typically don't get to vote. And so people can have very different conceptions of democracy. And they can seemingly agree, yes, they can both say democracy is good, but mean very, very different things by democracy. So how do we resolve a meaningful conceptual dispute, a conceptual issue? Well, these tend to be resolved rationally by argumentation. And this involves, presenting an adequate definition of the concept and defending that definition. It can also, of course, involve criticizing competing definitions. And we'll look at this in some detail when we look at, in the later methods, the argument by definition, which, not surprisingly, focuses on arguing about definitions, like what makes a definition better than another, and how would you actually fight about concepts. Now, whether or not you have to settle a conceptual issue or not as part of your paper depends on what issue you're addressing, how you're approaching it, what the concepts are, etc. And again, as a purely practical matter, the best way to find out is just check with me. Say, hey, do I have to argue, if I'm arguing about abortion and I'm making use of the term person in my argument, do I need to actually argue about personhood? And the answer in that case would be yes, definitely. And other cases, of course, would vary depending on the particular case. Now, the final and kind of defining part of a moral debate, a moral argument, is, of course, the morality, and values part of it. So what must be determined in settling a moral issue is the morality of the action, person, whatever it is you're debating about. And this is the core thing, the most important part of it, which is arguing to resolve the actual moral issue. And the facts and concepts can be important, but they are, so to speak, a supporting cast to the central character of the moral issue. Now, when you're debating about ethics, one thing that does come up is, we looked at the idea of like factual disputes, and then there's the value aspect. And so how do we distinguish between values and facts? Well, this can be quite contentious. Now, approaching it as neutrally as possible, here's what we can say. Value statements, or matters of value, are by definition normative. They express a judgment of value. Literally by definition, value statements express value. And they often contain a prescriptive element about what should be done, not just about what is. So, for example, saying capital punishment is wrong would be a value statement, normative. Now, there can be non-ethical ones. If you're talking about economics or aesthetics or religion, etc., those can also be value statements. But our main concern in ethics is, well, ethics. Now, a factual statement, a matter of fact, these are descriptive, and they are generally taken to be subject to testing, either actually or in theory, although there are some exceptions. Now, a factual statement is not the same thing as a fact. A fact, depending on how strict you are in defining it, is typically a claim that's been taken as proven, often beyond, say, like reasonable doubt, or really well established, depending on how strict you want to be about the facts. So a factual claim is one that is going to be either true or false. So a factual claim could be false. To use like a simple example, it's saying that mice are smaller than elephants would be a factual claim. It's true or false, and testable because you can measure them. Now, in philosophy and physics and other stuff, you can have factual claims that maybe we can't test. So, for example, if I claim that there is another reality, parallel reality that we can never go to, we really can't test that very well. I mean, you can imagine a sci-fi scenario where we, manage to go through like a portal or a gate or something, but we can make factual claims that would, in principle, not be testable. But as a practical matter, we generally take, factual matters to be, at least in theory, testable. And even in weird cases, we could kind of make up a way to test it, like a sci-fi portal to the other world. Now, another key part of ethics is objectivity versus subjectivity. Now, when we looked at the spectrum of morality, and we saw morality ranges from, absolutism, depending on the theory, down to subjectivism and nihilism. And so how do we deal with that? Well, an objective statement is a statement that is true or false, regardless of what people, think, feel, or believe. it is by definition a matter of fact, and hence, in the normal course of things, something testable. For example, that the Earth is roughly a sphere, roughly like a ball, is something that is a objective statement and is testable, and happens to be true. Subjective statements generally are defined as statements that are neither objectively true nor false. You can't really test them and resolve them. And these paradigm examples, or like when you talked about subjectivity and ethics, these are things like whether something tastes good to you or not, or whether something is pretty to you or not. So if someone says Rocky Road ice cream tastes better than vanilla ice cream, that's really not testable. You can't take 2 scoops of ice cream, place them in the ice creaminator, and have a numerical value of tastiness. You can test their calories, their vitamins or lack thereof, but the taste is in the tongue of the taster. I was going to say beholder, but in this case you'd be the tasterizer. Now, one of the core debates in ethics, which we saw when we talked a bit about the background for ethics, is this objective-subjective dispute. It's often believed that value claims are all subjective, that, it's all just expressing unsupported opinions. Now, this could be true. Value claims might all be subjective. That's to say, they might all be non-factual. But this is not something that can be simply assumed because it's not just obvious. It's a matter of substantial dispute because some pretty smart people have made some pretty good arguments to value being objective, like our good dead friend, Plato, and our good dead friends like Socrates and Aristotle and Confucius and so on have made pretty good arguments. And so one can't just simply say, pish posh, all these people are wrong. I have discovered for myself that ethics is subjective and I just see the truth. It's something that's got to be argued. Now, there are moral theories, which we looked briefly at, ethical subjectivism and ethical relativism, that are both based obviously on the view that morality is subjective or relative. But there are many other, hundreds, perhaps thousands of other moral theories based on the view that morality is objective, backed up by arguments. So to assume that value claims are subjective, or alternatively that they're objective, would be to do what's known in the business of philosophy as begging the question, which is a classic fallacy in which one simply assumes what needs to be proven. And of course, that's bad logic. Essentially, it's saying it's true because it's true, which doesn't prove things. Now, even if value claims are subjective, there are still better or worse reasons. So you may be wondering, how do as a practical matter, how do I grade a ethics paper if I don't know if ethics is objective? Or you may think it's all subjective. It's all just, opinion and BS, etc. So how can one assess this? Well, fortunately, we don't have to make when I'm grading, I don't have to make any assumptions about whether ethics is objective or subjective, because we can objectively agree that there are better or worse reasons that can be given in support of a value claim. That is to say, one can assess the argumentation independent of whether ethics is actually objective or subjective. For example, to use a very silly example, suppose we're debating capital punishment, and I say it's wrong because, if you look at the word capital, it has the letter C, the letter A, and the letter T, which of course spells out cat. And we all know what cats are. They are evil. Therefore, by the catativity of transitivity, capital punishment must be evil. Now, lest you think I don't like cats, I actually rather like cats. In fact, one reason I like them is when they are evil, because they're very good at what they do. That's why I like them, because the cats are cats and they do their cat things. Also really like dogs, because dogs are dogs and they do their dog things. They have their own, virtues and vices. Now, if I argue about capital punishment and I focus on things such as, bringing up statistics about how it doesn't deter crime, I bring up, facts showing that, people who are innocent have been executed, that people have been convicted who are also innocent, and that's applied, have an analysis that shows that it's disproportionately applied to, to people, applied unfairly. And I weave all of that into an argument that capital punishment, because it's unfair and ineffective, it involves killing people, is morally wrong. You may just say, pish posh piddle poo, and ethics is just subjective. I don't know where those words came from. Probably the Dr. Seuss thing. You may just reject that out of hand, but of course, that doesn't address the reasoning. It's just simply saying, oh, it's subjective, so no argument works, which of course is basically, completely unfair. Because someone could just say back to that, you're wrong. Ethics is totally objective, and they have just as much reason. And so we focus on the arguments as a practical matter. Now, since it's possible to argue rationally and well or poorly on subjective and objective matters, moral argumentation doesn't actually require that morality is objective, which is fortunate because I can't, prove it either way. And so as a practical matter, what I focus on is not whether I think you're right in your position, although I definitely have moral views. I focus on how well you argue it. And so as a practical matter when writing the paper, don't try to guess or research what you think I might believe, because if someone writes a terrible paper, even if I agree with them, it's still a terrible paper. And if someone writes a paper I completely disagree with morally, as long as it's well written, it gets the appropriate grade, because it's ethical to give a good grade to work that deserves a good grade. So in that case, I'm not really giving it, the person has earned it. Likewise for bad stuff. So next we'll turn to looking at argument basics, but this concludes the sort of general introduction to ethical reasoning.